There we go. So we'll only be recording the talk part, not the Q&A part afterwards. Okay, hello everyone and welcome to our third lecture in the International Centre of Philosophy Speaker Series. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy M Dentith, and I'm convening this series of talks which cover epistemology, Kantian ethics, Kantian philosophy, and the philosophy of science. I am very pleased to introduce to you my good friend and academic collaborator, Professor Brian L. Keeley, who is giving us the third talk in the series. This talk is being recorded by request. Brian is Professor of Philosophy at Pitzer College in Claremont, California. His research interests include neurophilosophy and the study of conspiracy theories, and he is the editor of a volume in the Cambridge University Press Contemporary Philosophy in Focus series on the work of Paul Churchland. He is the author of over 40 articles, book chapters, and reviews on a range of topics, which include the nature of the senses, neuroethology, artificial life, and the relationship of science to society. His talk today is titled Auto-experimentation, Essential, Foolhardy, or Both? And I invite him to present his talk now.
Great. Thank you very much, Em, and thank you to the center for inviting me to give a talk. Let me see if I can get the screen going here. Let's share that. Okay, and then I should be
very visible.
And there I should be a little bigger. Okay. Does that all look right, Em?
It looks perfect.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So yes, so thank you for inviting me, and also apologies in advance if we have internet problems. I'm in California. It's about 7 o'clock at night here, and it's very dark outside. So normally I have a much more sunlight coming in and staring me in the face, but I realized that at night all I've got is a little teeny light over there. But I'm sure we'll make do. I will gesticulate occasionally to get your attention. So yeah, the talk today. So as Em pointed out, my main area of research has actually been in the philosophy of neuroscience. I did work on animal behavior, particularly unusual sensory systems. I used to work on animals that perceive the world via electricity. They had electroreception, and that's for a lot of my work in the philosophy of science has revolved around how do we study unusual senses and what is the role of neuroscience in that role. But then also I published a paper on conspiracy theories many, many years ago, and that kind of has opened up a second area of interest that I have. This is going back a little bit to the philosophy of science interest. They're all kind of vaguely connecting to the philosophy of science in different ways, but this is a totally new kind of way of thinking through philosophy of science for me. And as I'll point out in a minute, it's still a bit of a work in progress. There's not a lot of work in philosophy on this topic, and I'm still trying to figure out whether there's not a lot of work because there's nothing there, or just because not very many people have paid attention to it. And so the question is, in the talk is, is auto-experimentation essential, foolhardy, or both? I'll go ahead and give you the conclusion, which is, I think in many ways, auto-experimentation is essential to a variety of different scientific approaches, but it might also be foolhardy in a number of places as well. So, like I said, it's a work in progress, and the topic is this idea of auto-experimentation, or what some people might call self-experimentation. And as I will define it, auto-experimentation is any experiment, not necessarily a scientific experiment, but usually, and we'll be talking about scientific experiments, any experiment in which the experimental subject is the same person as the experimental instigator, right? The person that's doing the study is also the subject of the study, although there's always kind of blurriness when you're talking about this case, because sometimes there are instances are involved. There are things that people can't do to themselves by themselves. Sometimes they do it by themselves, but sometimes they have experimental assistants to help them do it. And also I'm not going to talk about it so much, but there's kind of a bigger penumbra of issues that come up around not just experimenting on yourself, but experimenting on people who are near and dear to you, because there's also a number of times where the experimental subject is the child of the experimenter or the partner the romantic partner of the experimenter, or other people in the laboratory, perhaps. But I'm going to mostly try to be focusing on the paradigm case of a scientist who's doing research to themselves in order to often to do something experimental, to discover something about the nature of the natural world. Oops, let me see if I can get there we go. So the outline for today is it's actually pretty straightforward. Most of the talk is actually just the fun kind of history of science and looking at a variety of different cases of self-experimentation. And then after presenting a whole bunch of cases that I think hopefully will be fun and entertaining, also give some reflections on these cases. Like what are the philosophical concerns that come up when you start thinking about all these different cases? What are the ethical concerns, the practical, theoretical, and kind of epistemic considerations? Saying, well, why would anybody want to do these things to themselves? And then finally, I want to end with a little bit of a philosophical addendum to think about how philosophy and philosophical, perhaps, experimentation might fit in. So I always like this quote from the author novelist George Eliot, because I think in many ways it captures a lot of what we're going to be talking about this morning in China. Genius is an immense capacity for taking pains. So there's going to be a lot of pain involved in the example, and a lot of the people, arguably, might be considered geniuses. Because one of the things that really got me into this topic in the first place, like why did I get interested in self-experimentation? It was something that when I recognized that a large number, a surprisingly large number of Nobel Prizes have been awarded to people who conducted self-experimentation or auto-experimentation. And so there's a way in which, doing auto-experimentation might be a path to your Nobel Prize. So one of the earliest examples of this is Werner Forssmann from Germany, who got the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1929. And or actually, he got it in 1956 for the work that he did in 1929. And he performed the first cardiac catheterization. And this is a quote, him describing the work that he did. After prepping his left forearm with iodine and injecting Novocaine locally, he made an incision, and then finding a large vein, he passed a hollow needle into the vessel to hold it open, and then gently pushed a sterile 65-centimeter rubber catheter through the vein toward his heart. And then standing behind a fluoroscopic screen, he documented the rubber catheter tip ending up in the right atrium of his heart. And interestingly, the reason why Forssmann carried out this study was he wanted to do this. He thought this would be an interesting study and an interesting way of getting medicine directly into the heart. But he was actually turned down. He actually, he asked at his hospital to do it. They told him no, it was far too dangerous. Well, he like, can I do it on somebody else? Can I do it on somebody who's ill? Can I do it on myself? And he basically got told no over and over again. And eventually, this procedure that I just described, he actually kind of went rogue and did it to himself in the off hours at the hospital and got in a reasonable amount of trouble for it. Well, then, 20 years later, he gets the Nobel Prize. So I think they probably said it's all's fair at that point. But sticking a device up into your heart with nobody there to help you. Actually, I think there was a nurse that was involved that was watching over him as he did it, just in case. And that was part of the reason he got in trouble, was he got her in trouble when he was doing it. Another Nobel Prize associated with auto-experimentation is Barry Marshall, the Australian biologist who got a Nobel in 2005, also in physiology or medicine. And most of the examples I'm going to be giving are ones in physiology and medicine. So back in 1984, he showed that that a bacterium was primarily the cause of gastritis and peptic ulcer. So younger people in the audience may not realize this, but for many years, decades, it was thought that why do people get ulcers? Why do people get stomach ulcers? It was due to stress, right? And people were told, yeah, you just need to have a less stressful life. That's, you've got too much stress in your life, therefore that's why you're getting these ulcers. And you'll see this trope often in movies from the 1940s and 50s. People are drinking milk as a way of calming down and taking care of their ulcer. And Marshall became convinced that he thought it was actually an infection, that it was a form of infection. And because it was so entrenched to think that it was all about stress, nobody really believed him, right? And he kept making the case over and over again. And finally, in a kind of climactic experiment, he basically decided, okay, I'm just going to prove it. And so what he does is he goes into the hospital, he drinks a bottle of the bacterium, waits a couple of days, and then starts to develop the symptoms of a peptic ulcer and gastritis, started and was able to show that he had this condition. And then he gave himself antibiotics and they all went away. All the symptoms went away. And that kind of demonstration by basically infecting himself and then curing himself was one of the key steps in his convincing people that no, really, ulcers are about infection. They're not about stress. Stress may be a role, but the causative factor really is the infection, and did so through auto-experimentation. And here's an example that many of you may be familiar with, because it's a Chinese example, but I believe it's Tu Yu Yu. I'm not, my Chinese pronunciation is not good, but that's the Chinese name. Got the 2015 Nobel in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery of artemisinin. Artemisinin, actually my Latin is not any better than my Chinese. But this is a novel treatment against malaria. And it's relevant here because she was one of the first human subjects of the drug trials. And she was quoted as saying that as the head of the research group that was developing this new treatment, that she had the responsibility, right? That she wasn't going to ask others to participate in a drug trial, that she herself wasn't willing to be the first person to take it and be amongst the first group. And that is going to be a theme that we're going to sometimes see when it comes to Nobel Prizes, or especially with auto-experimentation, is this kind of almost ethical, or it is an ethical demand that, don't do to others what you're not willing to do to yourself. So 3 Nobel Prizes there. There's a few others that I could talk about, but it doesn't always work to get you a Nobel or to get you recognition. So some of you may be familiar, probably the most famous military hospital in the United States is Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C., and it's named after Major Walter Reed. And as it says in the Wikipedia entry, he was the leader of a 4-person team that confirmed the theory of a particular Cuban doctor, Carlos Finlay, that yellow fever, the disease that was ravaging much of the Caribbean and Latin America, that yellow fever was actually being transmitted by a particular mosquito species. The dominant theory at the time and at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was that it was due to direct contact. It was sort of more like tuberculosis, that if you get coughed on by somebody with the disease, then you'll get the disease. But Finlay had this idea that no, he thought it was a bloodborne disease and it was being carried particularly by mosquitoes. And there was an argument over which was the case. And Walter Reed was the member of the team that figured out that, in fact, it was being carried by the mosquitoes. But interestingly enough, Walter Reed is the one who has a hospital named after him. But the key person on that 4-man team was actually this person, Jesse William Lazar, a doctor on that team. And Lazar was the one who actually got him, basically intentionally had a mosquito feed on an infected patient who had yellow fever, and then had that mosquito bite him. And then he showed the symptoms of yellow fever quite soon after. And actually, as it turned out, he died from yellow fever. So he carried out this experiment and died. Unfortunately, Walter Reed got the hospital named after him. I think all William Lazare got named after him was a dormitory at Johns Hopkins University. There may be another science building at his alma mater, William Jefferson, and I think it's Lee and Jefferson College in the United States. So it doesn't always work to be the victim of a self-experimentation. It might get you killed, and it might be great and make an amazing result, but you don't actually get all the fame that the person who lived got. But the cases that I'm most familiar with are the ones that are in neuroscience, and that's where I'm going to try to focus on for most of the other examples that I want to give you. But in the history of neuroscience, there's a variety of really great examples of people doing self-experimentation and auto-experimentation. So Horace Wells is known as one of the kind of founding fathers of anesthesiology. And one of his claims to fame was in 1844, people were using nitrous oxide as kind of almost like a party trick. There were people who would go around the country and give people nitrous oxide. And as some of you may know, it's also known as laughing gas. And there would be these kind of nitrous oxide parties that would go on. I guess it's, it was the rave culture of the late and mid 1800s. But he saw one of these demonstrations and realized as he was watching, he saw one of the people on stage that was getting the drug, like bump into a chair, a piece of furniture on the stage quite hard, right? Hit it pretty hard, but then showed no effect. And he noticed it's like, oh, it's almost as if that person on nitrous oxide is actually kind of not feeling pain. So he decided, well, let me try it out. So literally the next day, apparently he had a tooth that needed to be extracted. So Wells inhaled some nitrous oxide and then had a friend extract the tooth, and then reported that, as he says, that he didn't feel as much as the prick of a pin, right? So he actually the very next day, immediately tries it and finds out that yes, indeed, this is an effective anesthetic. And then there's a variety of experiments. I mentioned that I was doing work on animals that perceived electricity. So this idea of animal electricity, that electricity plays a role in animal life, but also in particular that certain animals can generate electricity to use as a sensory system or to use as a defensive system, is something that I've been looking at for a number of years. But this was a phenomenon that a number of people were studying around the same time as electricity was being discovered, because early on it was known that you could create electrical discharges, or you could create a phenomenon through things like voltaic piles and that Volti and Galvani and others were creating. And it was also known that if you applied that electricity to living tissue or recently dead tissue, you could get kind of reactions. You could get hearts to beat that are after they've been extracted from the body of an animal. You could get muscles to contract and so forth. And one of the big questions was, well, is this electricity, this phenomenon that's being generated by things like voltaic piles, is it the same thing as what we're seeing in animals? Like, for instance, in electric fish and electric eels and torpedoes, these animals that can produce strong shocks. And also, is it the same thing as what we see when lightning strikes? And so they have their phenomena that looked very, very similar, but the question was, is this all one thing? And in the end, we did figure out it was just one thing. It was electricity in different amounts. But there was a period of time where it was unclear that these were all the same thing. So, as I said, the examples on trying to figure out whether animal electricity was the same as the galvanic force. And people like Humboldt, famous German physiologist, was doing these kinds of experiments. But also a number of these experiments, a number of the key experiments had to do with self-experimentation. By the way, here's a couple of examples. There's a voltaic pile on the lower left, and a young Humboldt up above. But also, people were familiar with electric eels as they were found in South America. And here's a horse that's being zapped by a couple of electric eels. You can barely see them in the water. It's not the best image, but it was one of the images in the 1800s of recognizing that there were these animals that were doing this amazing thing that could stun a horse. And they were wondering, is that the same phenomenon as what we're seeing in the voltaic piles that were coming out of physics laboratories? And what was basically done was people would basically shock themselves with an electric eel and shock themselves with a voltaic pile, and then report that, yeah, they felt the same, right? That they had a similar sort of effect. And so it was actually through this kind of self-experimentation, using themselves as the subject, shocking themselves with multiple different versions, and then reporting back that, yeah, it's the same kind of feeling. And one of the people that was doing this is Purkinje. So if you're a neuroscientist, you're familiar with Purkinje cells, which are a type of cell that he discovered. Purkinje was one of those people that was one of those kind of polymaths that was doing things in a variety of different fields. In addition, I'll tell you in a second about some of the electrical experiments he was doing. But he was also doing stuff like ingesting various substances and reporting back on what happens when you do so. So here is one where he's taking digitalis. So this is from one of his notebooks in 1825. He says, at about 8 o'clock in the morning and 1 hour after a full breakfast, I took a concentrated decoction of the leaves of digitalis, 2 drams and a half quart, boiled for half an hour. Towards about 10 o'clock, I became nauseated, and the pulse, whose ordinary rate was between 60 and 70, had slowed down to 54, missing many times in its heartbeat. And I felt a sensation of oppression with each beat, as if the heart had been seized by a hand. But otherwise, I felt invigorated. And he's noting, as a result of taking digitalis, that he's getting interesting visual disturbances, visual illusions. So he notes that during this time, the brain was not affected, at least it's not affecting him the way that, say, opium or camphor or datura might make you really speedy or slow you down. But he did notice a variety of visual effects. So he talks about, and he draws these figures of the kind of visual things that he was seeing that looked like the sort of thing you got when you kind of stuck a thumbnail into your eye or something like that, that you were getting out of these kind of visual illusions. And here's some other figures that he draws based on drugging himself. And then also notice that one of the other things that he's getting from down at the bottom, he's also doing galvanic stimulation. He's setting up these electrical impulses from a voltaic pile and then putting the electrodes to his head such that it'll zap across his eyeball. And then he's drawing what he sees when he does that. And so he also, as I said, does a lot of these galvanic self-stimulation experiments, passing kind of electrical currents through his head along various trajectories, right? So he might put them on either side of his temple or above one particular eye or back next to the ear and passing the electrical current through his head in different ways and then reporting back how this felt. And then Ernst Mach, a number of years later, kind of picks up these experiments and kind of continued them on when doing a number of his own experiments. Again, a lot of these experiments were self-experimentations or auto-experimentations. So he was doing things with studying the vestibular sense, so our sense of balance. So as you go back and forth, as you're standing upright versus laying down, you can feel the balance, balance shifting. And he invented this chair that spun, and you could spin around in the chair, and then he would stop the chair and then see what he would report. So here he is talking about one of these experiments where he says, once while performing one of these experiments, and after rotating so long that I was no longer conscious of the movement, I suddenly caused the apparatus to be stopped, whereupon I immediately felt and saw myself and the whole box rapidly flung around in rotation in the opposite direction. Although I knew that the whole apparatus was at rest and every outward point of reference for perception of motion was wanting. And he goes on to say, everyone who disbelieves in sensations of movements should be made acquainted with these phenomena. He's trying to establish the idea that the sense of balance was its own unique sense that's different from the other senses. And he says, I can prove it to you by, if you sit down in my chair, let me spin you around and then show you the kinds of feelings that you have while you're in it. And he also goes on to note that he says, I remembered the galvanic dizziness, which was observed by Ritter and Purkinje on the passage of a current through the head. When the persons experimented upon imagined they were falling towards the cathode. And so what he's describing is one of the experiments that Purkinje was doing is, as he was passing electricity through his head, now we realize that at some points he was passing electricity through his semicircular canals in his ear, which is the organ that controls balance. And when he passed electricity through that organ, he found himself feeling very dizzy and feeling an experience of vertigo. And Mach was able to report that the things that he experienced by spinning around in his chair seemed to be the exact same things that were being experienced by Purkinje when he was passing electricity. So showing that the nervous system is electrical in content, but also showing that you can stimulate this organ with electricity and have sensory experiences with it. But not only were people doing experiments and trying to establish balance or the vestibular sense as a unique sense, people were doing really interesting experiments also with cutaneous senses as well. And this is probably one of the earliest ones that I found out about that really got me interested in eventually one day kind of collecting together these examples and seeing what I could think about them. And some of you maybe know that in philosophy, in the philosophy of mind, there were these mind-brain identity theorists in the early 1960s who had a theory of mind that was based on the idea that mind just is brain, that just as water is nothing more than H2O, that the mind is nothing more than the brain. And the most famous example that's given is pain is C fiber firing, right? That there was this idea that there are these peripheral nerves in your body that are C fibers, and when they fire, you feel pain, and when you feel pain, C fibers are firing. That there's a kind of a direct identity between the mental phenomena of pain and the physical or neural phenomenon of C fiber firing. But if you're wondering where that came from, what are C fibers and why, what are A and B fibers, for example, that work all comes from the work of Henry Head. And Henry Head was the one who discovered that there are multiple different nerves in the periphery, and that these fibers are underwriting different kinds of senses, right? That certain senses, like the C fibers, they seem to be responsible for carrying pain information, whereas the A and B fibers are carrying things like temperature sensation, hot versus cold sensation, and others of the A and B fibers are carrying things like pressure, mechanical stimulation. So, your skin is responsible for picking up things like pain. It's picking up things like pressure. It's also picking up things like and reporting back things on temperature. It was Henry Head who did the experiments to show that, yeah, there are these separate, different systems, different neurons that are carrying these different senses or these different sensory modalities. And the way that he was able to show this is that he literally had a incision made in his arm, and then had the nerves of his arm cut. And because this is a peripheral system, not part of your central system, if you damage the neurons in your peripheral system, they will slowly grow back. It may take years, but they will eventually grow back. And so what he was able to do was to first have these nerves cut, and then over a period of time, every day, come back and retest the skin on his arm. When he first cut it, the arm, the muscle or the sensory system on his arm was basically numb, and he couldn't feel anything in the affected area. But then over a period, every day he would check it, or have an assistant help him check it every single day, and then showed that he got back certain sensations before he got back others. And the fact that he got back certain sensations before others indicated to him that there was different growth patterns and different growth speeds of the different cells. And then that pointed out that this idea that there are different cells that are carrying out these different sensory things. And he called them A, B, and C, depending on how fast it took them to grow back. And you got to remember, this is being done in the early 20th century when there were no antibiotics. So giving yourself an incision could very well kill you if it got infected. So this was a rather dangerous thing to do. But here he is talking about what he did. So he says an incision 6.5 inches, 106 or 16.5 centimeters long, was made in the outer bicipital fossa, extending along the axial line of the left upper extremity. The wound was almost exactly bisected by the fold of the elbow. After turning back the skin, one of the nerves was hooked outwards, and the radial nerve was divided. In other words, it was cut at the point where it arises from a particular point in the musculospiral spot. A small portion was excised, and the ends of the united with fine silk sutures. Yeah, fine silk sutures. The external cutaneous nerve was also divided, where it perforates the fascia above the point where its two branches are given off to supply the anterior and posterior aspects of the preaxial half of the forearm. The nerve was sutured with fine silk, and the wound was closed with silk sutures without drainage. The limb was put up on a splint, and the forearm flexed at the elbow, and the whole hand was left free for testing. And then the wound was healed by first intention. And then the following morning, the radial half of the back of the hand and the dorsal surface of the thumb were found to be insensitive to stimulation with cotton wool, to pricking with a pin, and to all degrees of hot and cold. And then over a period of years, here's his hand, and over a period, it literally was multiple years of every day going in and having a assistant carefully use different kind of probes on his hands while he was not looking, and he would tell whether he could feel it or not, and then they were able to draw these maps on his hands and then do the photography. But this is showing, the hand, and now they've driven, all the areas that are enclosed in the circle are areas where he couldn't feel anything immediately after. This is May 16th, so about a month after he had the surgery done to transect his nerve. And then over a series, this is in a paper that he published a couple of years later, over a period of time, here it is 31 days after the operation. It goes in and there's a little triangle there where he can feel cutaneous stimuli, but but he could feel temperature. And then here's, June 14th, 1903, taking a look again. Each day, you can see on the left-hand side, the scar that's left from the incision that he had performed on himself as it's healing up. And over time, this is 56 days after the operation. Things are slowly growing back and he's getting sensation back in his hand. Here's 86 days after the operation. And he says no part of the forearm was entirely insensitive to cutaneous painful stimuli. So the pain stimulation came back fairly quickly. Here it is 152 days after the operation. It's doing this day after day after day. Here's 567 days after the operation. He's still going in, having these different stimuli placed on his arm. And as he says here, the dotted line corresponds to the parts sensitive after shaving, to cotton wool, and to Van Fry's tactile hairs, which was a kind of a stimulus that people would do, showing that he's now regained sensation in all these areas that were insensitive before. Oops, hold on. And other experiments that he was doing at the same time, he found out there was kind of some interesting things that we now call referral, or he called them referral as well, where if you touched a certain part of the area as it was growing back, you could touch one part of the arm, but you would report feeling it in a different place. So if you touch the back of the hand, you might actually feel it in the thumb, and vice versa, showing that as the nerves are growing back, the brain is kind of remapping where the sensations actually are. So these are a variety of different experiments that people have done that are where they made themselves their own subject. Well, why would you ever do it, right? What are the reasons for doing these kinds of experiments on yourself? Well, if you look at the kind of work that I just described, and as well as some other work that I didn't describe, you find the scientists themselves giving a number of different explanations. So here's D.L.J. Freed, actually in 1987, somebody who's making a case for auto-experimentation in the modern era. He says, why do we do it? Because we are cheaper and more representational of human beings than 100 laboratory rats, because we are better informed of the risks and possible benefits than probably anyone else in the world, because we are impatient of bureaucratic delays and burning with our need to know the answer, because we believe that the potential benefits to mankind are great, and perhaps also out of a zest for adventure, not necessarily a shameful motive. And I really like this quote because I think it actually captures a variety of different ideas of what you see people saying, particularly scientists saying, why it is that they carry out their studies. And we'll see a number of these brought up again as we go forward. So George Pickering in 1949 kind of makes a moral case for auto-experimentation, right? So this probably reflects a little bit of what we saw in the Chinese researcher studying the malarial treatment. The experimenter has one golden rule to guide him as to whether the experiment is justifiable. Is he prepared to submit himself to the procedure? If he is, and if the experiment is actually carried out on himself, then it is probably justifiable. If he is not, then the experiment should not be done. Right. So there's kind of a golden rule of, if you really want to make sure that the experiment that you're doing is ethical and justifiable, is the scientist willing to have it done to themselves? If they're not willing to have it done to themselves, then that's a sign that perhaps there's something not completely above board. Or to think about the example of Head, who did the transection of his arm muscle over and had it studied for years at a time. He had actually tried to do those experiments on others with other subjects, but was not able to get good data out of it, right? As he says, it soon became obvious that many observed facts would remain inexplicable without experimentation carried out more carefully and for a longer period than was possible with the patient, however willing, whose ultimate object in submitting himself to observation is the cure of his disease. See, yeah, you can get volunteers to do work if you're gonna cure them of a disease, but asking somebody to abstain from alcohol consumption, which is something that Head did with his experiment, right, is something that is just more than a lot of subjects are willing to do. Doesn't matter how much money you're going to give them, they're just not going to be able to put in the long, hard work it takes to have a muscle or have a nerve transected in your arm and then come in every single day and have it and make sure you maintain a stable diet for years at a time. The experimenter himself is willing to do that because they want the data, but other people perhaps just aren't willing to put that work in. He also notes that it's unwise to demand any but the simplest introspection from patients, whatever class they may belong, right? That he's trained as somebody who can clearly report back what he needs to have reported back. It's not easy to do that with somebody who is a naive subject. And he also says that introspection can be made fruitful by the personal experience of a trained observer only. So, oops, I just noticed I have a chat. Let me make sure there's, okay. Or here's Perkinji giving his reasons for doing auto-experimentation. He says, as physiologists, we search for the manifestation and laws of life in all their forms, and subjective experience is just part of our heuristic, learning and discovering apparatus, right? So he's like, why should there be anything against doing self-experimentation or auto-experimentation? Your own personal feelings about things are perfectly legitimate things to be looking at. And my apologies for folks from outside of the United States, but there was a famous commercial that was big in the 1970s, which I think actually kind of shows a little bit about what's going on in a normal experimental setup, a non-auto experimentation case.
What's this stuff? Some cereal. It's supposed to be good for you. Do you try it? I'm not going to try it. You try it. I'm not going to try it. Let's get Mikey. Yeah. He won't eat it. He hates everything. He likes it. Hey, Mikey.
When you bring life home, don't tell the kids it's one of those nutritional cereals you've been trying to get them to eat. You're the only one who has to know.
Yeah, so I think in many ways, George Pickering would have a bone to pick with these two young men, that they're not willing to do the experiment on themselves, but they're willing to get somebody else to do it. Basically, Pickering's argument is if you're not willing to do it yourself, then you probably shouldn't be doing the experiment at all. Of course, here the joke is on them because it turns out apparently the cereal tastes good anyway. Actually, I've had Life cereal. It wasn't that great. So actually, this is typical advertising. So why do it? What kind of lessons do I draw from why auto experimentation might be an essential thing in science? Well, first of all, there's just the issues of practicality. It can be just easier, cheaper, quicker, etc., to carry out the experiment. You've got access to the information and to the tools, and you can sometimes do things more quickly with yourself than going through all the processes that there is required for lining up other subjects and working on them. And it also may just be a matter of not just practicality, but feasibility. It may be the scientist is the only person capable of pulling it off. I think Head's example of doing a multi-year cutaneous nerve study, I mean, he's really the only one who was in a position to actually do that. Or some of you may be familiar with a neuroscientist, Russ Poldrake, who does work on functional imaging. He carried out a project many years ago where basically he had himself scanned every single day, or at least most days he was able to go in and get himself scanned. And that's because he was doing fMRI research himself. So he had access to the machine. He was doing the work. He would just make sure that every time he set up an experiment, he would run the experiment on himself first and do a scan. And so then he's one of the people that we have really long-term data over years of how his brain has changed over many years of his adult life. And that's because he's the actual PI and in the room and can make sure that he can collect the data. Having a subject come in for years at a time is just unreasonable. He has to be there anyway, so why not just have him get his brain scanned? There are also issues of propriety in some cases, and my favorite example of this is in 1915, E.G. Boring wanted to do a study on sensation, but particularly he was interested in sensations felt in the digestive tract. And so not to put too fine a point on this, he basically, to put it bluntly, he was putting things up his butt in order to feel what he could feel inside of his lower digestive tract. And for reasons of propriety, he really wasn't willing to do that to other people, but he was willing to do it to himself in the privacy of his own laboratory by himself, and then report back what he felt and what kinds of either pain sensation and also temperature sensation that he was able to report in the lower intestinal tract. And it was just because and actually several of his assistants at that time were women that he worked with, and he certainly wasn't going to be doing it with them. He just thought that was inappropriate. And as we noted before, there's Sir George and his golden rule when it comes to ethics, that there might be ethical reasons for wanting to at least start the experiment on yourself before trying it on other people. And a fifth reason might be generative, connected. And by the way, these are not mutually exclusive reasons. There are often multiple of these reasons might be at play in any given experiment. But as Seth Robert puts it, self-experimentation as a source of new ideas. He has a paper, this is the paper, and it's 10 examples about sleep, mood, health, and weight, where he basically is somebody in the dietary sciences who basically uses himself as a subject to try to figure out different things to do with diet. And again, let me just try it on myself and see what happens when I ingest certain things and do certain kinds of dietary regimens. I can at least start generating hypotheses by trying out ideas on myself first, and then from there I can maybe move to a larger trial with multiple people. But I get the idea by trying things on myself first. And then there's a variety of reasons why auto-experimentation is important for things like self-affirmation of one sort or another. Like if you're the case of Marshall, who's trying to prove to the world that ulcers are being caused by infection and not being caused by stress, and not having anybody believe you, well, against that kind of critical reception, a radical new idea might be demonstrable by going it alone and just trying it out on yourself. Like, I can't get anybody else to do it, so I will do it to myself and show that it'll work. And also, I think we see another kind of version of this kind of self-affirmation, where scientists seek first-person experience of a phenomenon rather than settling for third-person accounts of the same, right? That if you really want to be sure about the results that you're getting, do it yourself and see what you discover, instead of having to, translate from the experience of a third person who you're doing things with. And then sometimes, as we say, the first person is actually the point, right? If you're trying to figure out, like for instance, the efficacy of an anesthetic, the whole point is, does the anesthetic get rid of the first person experience of pain? Well, if what you're after there is really not third person facts about the nature of the world, but actual first person facts about whether something feels a particular way, well, then, and again, you might well be the best person to be that first person. And the last reason might be the one that we saw also in that long quote, just simply a sense of adventure, right? That you might just, why not? It's some people like to explore. Some people go on the space station, either the current Chinese space station or the International Space Station, launched by the United States and Europe, right? There are scientists that go there. It's dangerous, right? People die when they try to go to space stations and the rockets explode. But we think it's okay, or think it's fine that people to put their lives at risk to do things like go into space. and also sometimes carry out scientific experiments in space. And we think that, somebody having a sense of adventure is not something that necessarily should be considered a bad thing. That doing these kinds of explorations and using yourself for auto-experimentation might well be an interesting form of adventure and reason for why to do auto-experimentation. So those are the main reasons that I've kind of pulled out of the literature, and I'd be curious to hear if other people have other reasons. But the thing I'd like to leave you with is an idea that maybe self-experimentation or auto-experimentation shouldn't be alien to those of us that are philosophers. Because if you think about it, philosophical thought experiments, or what Dan Dennett likes to call intuition pumps, in a sense, they're a form of auto-experimentation, right? That's when a philosopher is writing a paper, right, and trying to figure out, well, what's a good thought experiment to explore the issue that I'm doing. Often their first subject is themselves, right? They just try to think through, what are my intuitions about this particular scenario, or how can I tweak the scenario to kind of push my intuitions in certain ways. So often the starting point for many philosophical thought experiments are themselves auto-experimentation. So that's why I was saying before, this may not just be a phenomenon about scientific experimentation, but it may play a role in something like philosophical experimentation as well, and the idea of thought experiments. So that's it. Let me stop sharing. And hopefully that went okay.
That was perfect, Brian. I just had to turn my my mic on. The realization I was saying things, and you wouldn't be able to hear a single thing that was being said. Around
no AV problems. You never interrupted, so I assume you could hear them.
Yep. No, I heard all. I saw all. I monitored everything. See, it's a round of virtual applause for our guest speaker, I think, is in order here. I'll do an actual physical applause and hand, although it always looks very condescending when you're clapping on, because Zoom, of course, does a really good job of making sure that loud noises disappear. So I'll give you a nice condescending clap there. And I'm going to end the recording now as we move into our Q&A section.